More than 2 months after announcing his 2024 run, former President Trump is set to hold his first public campaign event of the election cycle tomorrow in New Hampshire. Then later in the day, he'll travel to South Carolina, appearing with Governor Henry McMaster and Senator Lindsey Graham. Our Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill, joining me right now. Well, hello and happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday to you too, Adrienne. Good to be with you.
I know you just wrote this new column, Trump hits the road after a lackluster campaign launch, which is on thehill.com right now. But, in terms of the pomp and circumstance that usually surrounds a presidential candidate, does former President Trump even need that, considering who he is and how loyal his base is?
I think that is a great question because clearly he is the dominant figure in the race. Now, his standing has declined a little bit after the midterm elections. He is under a new threat from the rise of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. But he's obviously not a candidate who needs, name recognition or media attention. He gets that in leaps and bounds. I think the question is this sense that there was a little bit of a false start. There was the speech at Mar-a-Lago that you mentioned in mid-November. And after that, there wasn't a lot of anything. So now this is a return to more traditional campaigning, going to 2 key early primary states in one day, speaking to a Republican meeting in New Hampshire, so trying to convince people who are not yet convinced of his appeal, and then having his own event, a show of strength, really, in South Carolina later in the day.
But conventionality and Donald Trump should never be in the same sentence. I mean, there's no candidate more atypical than Donald J. Trump. So in terms of that, 2 other potential candidates for presidency, Nikki Haley, it's been talked about. She's not official yet. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, again, there's a lot of talk. People are encouraging him to run, but not official yet, are not going to be expected to attend Trump's event this weekend. So are Republicans kind of waiting to see what happens, what the vibe is like with people in the GOP, and also who else could be running?
Certainly trying to read the vibes for sure. Look, this is a contest. It's not a coronation, right? Trump has a large proportion of the base who are behind him no matter what, but not necessarily enough to just sweep to victory. We've mentioned DeSantis, you mentioned Haley and Tim Scott, other candidates like former Vice President Pence, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, all competing here. So you do have people who are just keeping their powder dry for the moment, seeing how this is going to develop, seeing how Trump begins to run, and seeing who else gets into the race. There are a lot of pieces in flux here, and a lot of people are waiting for those to settle a bit before they decide which horse to back.
Okay, well, in terms of vice president for former President Trump in running again, this is interesting. There are a lot of headlines about Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene seeing herself on the shortlist for VP. At least that's according to Steve Bannon. Not sure what Steve Bannon, in terms of how much his words carry weight in this discussion, but what type of vice president would former President Trump be looking for? More like a mild-mannered conservative or somebody really out there?
So I think your question really gets to the most important part here. It's not really whether he would choose Marjorie Taylor Greene or not. It's what type of vice president he would need or want. And so I personally doubt it would be her because she's just so controversial. But I think there is a key difference here from 2016. In 2016, then candidate Trump, I think, felt obligated to choose a more orthodox, conventional figure, Mike Pence, to reassure what was then the Republican establishment. I don't think he feels that need anymore. I think he feels that he could choose a MAGA Republican of some kind to really underline his appeal to the base, to underline what you started talking about at the start, his own lack of conventionality. I don't think he needs to make nice with the Republican establishment anymore.
And I think it would be very fascinating if he did choose a woman as his vice president. That could be a recipe for a win, or it could backfire. We'll find out what people think. But yeah, still certainly historic for him. Thank you so much, Niall. Have a great weekend.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.